The bright lights of the television studio glared down, casting harsh shadows over the glitzy set. The familiar hum of the audience's chatter slowly faded as the camera rolled, zooming in on the sleek talk show host, Max Caldwell, who was sitting behind his shiny desk. He flashed a toothy grin into the lens, his smug expression hiding the tension brewing in the air. "Tonight," Max announced, his voice booming over the microphone, "we've got a very special episode for you. We've invited two of Hollywood's biggest stars, Tom Cruise and Sandra Bullock. You know them, you love them. But tonight, they'll be facing something they haven't before me." The audience chuckled nervously, not entirely sure where this was going. But they knew Max was notorious for his blunt and sometimes rude interview style. It was all part of the show's reputation, an edginess that kept people tuning in for the drama. Max's sharp words were his trademark, and nobody was safe from his critique, not even A-list celebrities like Tom Cruise and Sandra Bullock. From the side stage, Tom Cruise and Sandra Bullock exchanged a glance. Tom, wearing his trademark suit and sunglasses, gave a subtle nod to Sandra, who was dressed in a classic black dress, her trademark smile firmly in place. Both were used to public scrutiny, their careers spanning decades of ups and downs. They had been through the highs and lows of fame, but this was different. Tonight wasn't about friendly banter or mutual respect. It was about confrontation. As the music played, signaling the arrival of the guests, the crowd erupted in applause. Tom and Sandra stepped onto the stage, their smiles never faltering, even as Max watched them with an air of arrogance. The tension was palpable, and the audience couldn't help but wonder, what would happen next? Max motioned for them to sit, his smirk never wavering as they took their seats. "Thank you both for being here tonight," Max said, leaning forward in his chair. "I've got a lot of questions for you, and let me tell you, they're not the kind of questions you're used to answering. You two have spent your careers playing it safe, always the charming, lovable stars. But let's be honest for a moment. Everyone knows Hollywood's full of plastic people, obsessed with appearances and perfection. So let me ask you this, Tom. How much of the real you is left after all these years of pretending?" Tom's eyes flashed for a brief second, a flicker of something in his gaze that the audience couldn't quite place. It was a mix of amusement and something else, something deeper. Sandra's posture shifted slightly, sensing the shift in energy. She had worked with Tom for years, and they both understood the nature of the game they were playing. But Max was crossing a line. She knew it, and she wasn't about to sit quietly. Max didn't stop there. He turned his attention to Sandra, leaning in with a sly grin. "And you, Sandra, you've always been the quirky, fun and lovable star. But tell me, do you think people really care about your girl-next-door image, or are they just buying into the illusion? How much of your real self is really out there?" The crowd gasped. Max's words were sharp, cutting through the usual Hollywood charm that people expected from stars of Tom and Sandra's caliber. It was clear he wasn't here to flatter them. He was here to provoke, to get a reaction, one that would leave the audience talking. Sandra's fingers tightened around the edge of her chair. The air was thick with the tension of the moment, and Max seemed to relish in the discomfort. But what he didn't know was that Tom and Sandra had more than just charm and smiles up their sleeves. This sets the stage for a showdown. Tom and Sandra, though public figures known for their likable personas, are about to face a ruthless host and a confrontation that will make or break the image they've worked so hard to craft. But what Max doesn't realize is that beneath their calm exteriors lies a quiet wisdom and strength that no amount of rudeness can shake. The true test of character is about to begin. The silence that followed Max's words was thick, almost suffocating. The audience was waiting, hanging on to every second, their eyes darting between Tom, Sandra, and the host. Max's grin remained, smug and unbothered, as though he were sure they would crack under pressure. But both Tom and Sandra remained calm, their eyes steady, their posture unshaken. It had been years since either of them had encountered a challenge like this. An interview that felt less like a conversation and more like a deliberate attempt to tear them down. In the public eye, Tom Cruise was a legend, known for his action-packed roles, his charming smile, and his unwavering confidence. Sandra Bullock, the queen of rom-coms, was beloved for her humor, wit, and relatability. Together, they were an iconic duo, an undeniable force in Hollywood. But in this moment, they were facing something neither of them had anticipated. Tom took a slow, deliberate breath before leaning slightly forward, his voice steady as he responded. Max, I've been in this business long enough to understand that people have a tendency to misunderstand. They see the smiles, the interviews, the movies, and they think they know who I am. But the truth is, none of that defines me. You're right, we all wear masks in this industry. But those masks aren't always what people think they are. There was a quiet weight to his words. It wasn't a boast or a defense. It was a simple statement, wrapped in years of experience and understanding. Tom wasn't just a Hollywood star. He was a survivor of the industry's darkest moments. Someone who had faced personal and professional storms and still managed to rise. But tonight, it wasn't about defending his image. It was about confronting the truth. Sandra, sitting beside him, gave a small, knowing smile. Her presence was softer, but equally as powerful. Sandra's path through Hollywood had been marked by her ability to transcend the typical roles she was offered. From a quirky comedic actress to someone who had taken on roles that challenged societal expectations, Sandra had mastered the art of being herself, authentic and real, despite the industry's obsession with perfection. Her eyes met Max's and she didn't flinch. We don't just show up here to put on a show, Max. What you see on screen is a product of years of hard work, of struggles, of growth. Sure, I might laugh at the silly roles or charm people with a smile, but it doesn't mean I'm playing a character all the time. She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. You might think you know who I am, but you're missing the point. People love the image we've created, but it's the real moments, the quiet ones, that make all of this meaningful. The joy is in the realness, not in the facade. Max scoffed, visibly taken aback by their calm responses. He had expected them to be rattled, to fight back with words or flustered defensiveness. But instead, they were teaching him a lesson, one he hadn't anticipated. His eyes narrowed, a mix of irritation and amusement crossing his face. The audience was now on the edge of their seats, waiting for what would come next. Well, well, Max said with a mocking tilt of his head. You two sure have learned to play the game well. But let's be honest, aren't you just selling an illusion? How much of this authenticity is just another part of the act? Sandra leaned back in her chair, eyes gleaming with a quiet confidence. Illusions, she repeated softly. Maybe it's not an illusion. Maybe you're just looking at us the wrong way. Tom smiled slightly, the corners of his mouth turning up just enough to show that he understood the deeper layers of what Sandra was saying. The world Max seemed to live in was one where people were constantly at odds, constantly fighting to outdo one another. But Tom and Sandra knew that their journey in Hollywood wasn't about competing. It was about surviving, evolving, and growing in the face of relentless expectations. It wasn't just about fame, and it never had been. They had both suffered through personal and professional hardships. Tom had experienced the highs and lows of his career, from being a box office king to facing public scrutiny over his personal life. Sandra, too, had faced setbacks, from the pressure of being a leading lady to the struggles of navigating her private world while the public watched. But through it all, they had learned that the true measure of success wasn't the image others projected on them. It was the strength to keep moving forward. The tension in the room grew heavier as Max tried to navigate this new terrain. His usual tactics of mocking and belittling weren't working, and the audience was starting to pick up on the shift. It was no longer about putting Tom and Sandra on the defensive. It was about confronting the truth they were unwilling to acknowledge. Max's voice was sharper now. I'll tell you what. You're here because people admire you, because they want to be like you. But it's all based on this illusion, this act you put on. So tell me, how long can you keep it up? Tom's gaze didn't waver. There was a calmness about him that felt both grounded and unbreakable. How long can you keep up this act of yours, Max? He asked, his voice low but clear. You're trying to tear down something that's real, something we've worked hard for. But the question is, how much longer can you keep feeding off the negativity and conflict before it eats you alive? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, Max was speechless. The audience, too, fell silent. It was a mic drop moment, but one that went unnoticed in the usual sense. Tom wasn't boasting or showing off. He wasn't defending himself in the way Max had expected. Instead, he had turned the question back on the host, exposing the emptiness of the approach that Max had embraced for so long. Sandra joined in, her tone thoughtful. People like you think the world runs on what you can take from others. But the truth is, the world runs on what we can give. She paused, giving Max a steady look. You might want to try that sometime. The tension in the studio was now palpable. Max, for the first time in the interview, had no retort. His usual sharp responses had failed him, leaving him to grapple with the weight of Tom and Sandra's words. And the audience? They were riveted. What had started as a confrontation between a brash talk show host and two beloved stars had now turned into something much more profound. A quiet lesson in humility and authenticity. The tension in the room was now palpable, a thick, suffocating atmosphere that clung to the air. The audience, normally eager to applaud and react, was silent. Even the crew backstage, accustomed to the scripted chaos of talk shows, seemed to hold their breath. The wheels of Max Caldwell's talk show had shifted into unfamiliar territory, and for the first time in a long time, it wasn't under his control. Max sat back in his chair, clearly stunned by the response from Tom and Sandra. His usual smirk faltered for a split second, replaced by a subtle, yet undeniable flicker of uncertainty. This wasn't the reaction he'd been expecting. He was used to rattling his guests, digging into their vulnerabilities. But Tom and Sandra had not only weathered the storm, they had turned the tide in their favor. They were teaching him a lesson, not through confrontation, but through an unspoken resilience that was impossible to dismiss. For a moment, the show felt like it was slipping from Max's hands, and that thought made his irritation grow. He had built his reputation on pushing celebrities to their limits, pulling the curtain back on their perfectly constructed personas, exposing the raw, imperfect people underneath. But this was different. This wasn't a game anymore. Max leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. You think you've won, huh? He asked, his voice taking on a colder edge. You're not invincible, Tom. People love you, sure, but they're fascinated by the mess too. You've been in the headlines for all the wrong reasons. I don't think you're some untouchable icon. You're just a man, flawed like the rest of us. Tom's expression didn't change. His jaw was tight, but his eyes were unwavering. Maybe I am, he replied calmly. But it's not the flaws that matter. It's how you handle them. That's the difference between a person and a character. The quiet strength in Tom's words was like a steady pulse, a reminder of how much he had fought for in his career. From his controversial moments to his meteoric rise and subsequent fall, Tom had always faced public scrutiny with a kind of grace that few could understand. And it wasn't because he didn't care. It was because he had learned to not let other people define his worth. He defined it for himself. Sandra, noticing the subtle shift in Max's demeanor, added with a sly smile. Max, you don't get it, do you? You've been chasing headlines for so long that you've forgotten what it means to actually live. Her voice was softer than Tom's, but it carried a quiet authority. We may be in the spotlight, but that doesn't mean we're immune to the real struggles. Everyone has a story. We don't exist just for your entertainment. Max's lips curled into a sneer. He had been expecting resistance, but not this kind of measured deflection. It was as though every attack he launched was being absorbed and returned with something far deeper than he had anticipated. And then, just as Max opened his mouth to respond, the unthinkable happened. A loud crash echoed from behind the set. Everyone jumped in their seats, including Max, who had to steady himself. The audience gasped in unison, their attention momentarily diverted from the confrontation on stage. Camera operators scrambled, and chaos ensued backstage, muffled voices and hurried footsteps filtering into the live broadcast. It was an unexpected disruption, one that momentarily knocked the show off its carefully calculated trajectory. What was that? Max demanded, his voice rising in confusion and frustration. His eyes darted to the crew, who were clearly flustered. He was losing control of both the interview and the set. Meanwhile, Tom and Sandra exchanged a brief glance, both of them fully aware of what was happening behind the scenes. Sandra, ever the professional, didn't flinch. Tom, on the other hand, seemed more intrigued than anything else. This wasn't just another technical hiccup. Something was off. Before anyone could react further, a producer rushed onto the stage, his face pale. "Max, we have a problem. There's a disturbance backstage. It's getting out of hand." His words came out in short, sharp bursts, as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening. Max, who prided himself on being in control of every situation, visibly stiffened. "What do you mean, disturbance? What's going on back there?" I'm not sure," the producer stammered. "There are reports of a security breach. We're trying to get everything under control, but..." The producer's voice trailed off as Max's eyes flashed with annoyance. He could feel his carefully crafted show slipping from his grasp. This wasn't the kind of challenge he was used to, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't know how to respond. Tom, sensing an opportunity to regain control of the room, leaned forward in his chair, his voice cutting through the growing tension. "Max," he began, his words deliberate, "maybe it's time you realize that not everything can be controlled. Sometimes, you have to let go of the reins and see what happens. You can't always control what's behind the curtain." Sandra smiled, nodding in agreement. "Life's not a show, Max. It's messy, and you can try all you want to make everything perfect, but that doesn't make it real." Her tone was calm, almost sympathetic, as though she genuinely felt bad for the host's lack of understanding. Max's grip on the edge of the desk tightened, his knuckles white. "You two think you're so enlightened, don't you?" he spat, his voice dripping with bitterness. "You're not above this. You're just like everyone else. You pretend to be the good guys, but I know the truth. You've made your millions, and now you want to act like the humble saints of Hollywood. But you're just playing a part." Sandra's expression darkened slightly, the smile fading from her lips. She was no longer going to let Max's provocations slide. "That's the thing, Max," she said slowly, choosing each word carefully. "You think we're playing a part. But what you don't realize is that we've earned the right to say what we say. We've lived through the same struggles as anyone else. Just because we're on a different stage doesn't mean we're not human." Tom nodded in agreement, his tone unwavering. "The truth is, Max, we're all just trying to find some meaning in this crazy world. The difference is, some of us are willing to face it head-on, even when it's uncomfortable." Max shot them a look, furious that they weren't reacting the way he had expected. The audience, sensing the shift in power, started to murmur, and Max's frustration continued to bubble just beneath the surface. He wasn't going to let this go. Not now. "Enough of this philosophical nonsense," Max snapped. "You've both made your points. But I'm not done yet." And with that, Max leaned in, the next round of questioning just beginning. But this time the dynamic had changed. Tom and Sandra were no longer just guests in a hot seat. They were forces to be reckoned with. And Max had unwittingly opened the door for an entirely new kind of confrontation. The tension between Max Caldwell and his guests, Tom Cruise and Sandra Bullock, simmered beneath the surface, building in intensity with each passing second. What had started as a playful, albeit edgy, interview was quickly morphing into a battle of egos, one where neither party was willing to back down. Tom and Sandra had shown an unexpected strength, not only in their deflection of Max's attempts to rattle them, but in their steadfast resolve to hold on to their dignity in the face of ridicule. Max, however, had underestimated their ability to withstand his provocations. He had spent years cultivating a reputation for tearing down celebrities. Yet now, for the first time in a long time, he was facing guests who didn't flinch under pressure. But the stakes were about to rise in a way none of them had anticipated. The disturbance backstage was escalating, and Max could feel it creeping into the set, threatening to spiral into something far bigger than a simple celebrity interview gone wrong. The security breach was no longer a minor inconvenience. It was starting to feel like an insurrection. Tom and Sandra's calm responses, once the focal point of the conflict, were now being overshadowed by the growing chaos behind the curtains. The producers were huddled together near the control room, frantically discussing the situation. "What do you mean the situation is escalating?" One of them barked into his walkie-talkie. "Get more officers out there. We need to keep this under control. This isn't just some rowdy fans." His face was pale, and his hands trembled as he clutched his phone. The security staff had reported something more than just the typical disruptions. There were signs of organized activity, perhaps even a protest or some sort of planned disruption meant to undermine Max's show. Max's eyes darted to the stage entrance. The cameras kept rolling, but the crew's tension was palpable. This was no longer just about Tom and Sandra's comments. It was about the future of the show itself. With ratings dropping and a growing reputation for controversy, Max couldn't afford to lose control, not when his reputation as the king of talk show hosts was on the line. The whispers of unrest in the studio were starting to reach the audience, a ripple of unease running through the crowd. Tom noticed the shift immediately. He had spent years in Hollywood, navigating the undercurrents of public opinion and understanding the unspoken signals. He had seen how a set could go from playful banter to full-blown chaos in the blink of an eye. Something was off. He glanced over at Sandra, who was now sitting a little straighter, her usual calm demeanor replaced by an edge of alertness. It wasn't just the interview anymore. There was something brewing backstage, something that might change everything. "We should probably talk about what's happening behind the scenes," Sandra said, her voice quiet but firm. She leaned forward, her gaze meeting Max's with a sharp intensity that he hadn't expected. "You're playing games with the wrong people, Max." Max blinked, taken aback. "What are you talking about?" he snapped, his irritation mixing with anxiety. His fingers drummed against the desk, a sign that his composure was beginning to slip. Sandra's smile was thin. "You've been so focused on tearing us down that you missed what's been happening right under your nose." Her voice lowered, enough for only Max and the crew to hear. "People are fed up, Max. With your show. The ratings are down, the public is tired of this circus act." A wave of discomfort washed over Max, but he refused to let it show. He was used to taking jabs, but this one hit harder than he had anticipated. "If that's what you think, then maybe you don't understand the business," Max said, the venom in his tone unmistakable. "I'm here to entertain, to give the people what they want. You think your little speeches make a difference? The world doesn't care about what's real. They care about the drama, the chaos." Tom leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. He had been quiet for a while, observing the dynamics play out. Now he spoke, his voice steady and measured. "Max, you're so caught up in your idea of what entertainment is. You've forgotten what it means to actually connect with people." His words were pointed, not accusatory, but full of a wisdom that Max couldn't ignore. "You're creating something fake. The world is tired of fake." Max scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "And you think you can change that? What are you, some kind of crusader for truth?" Sandra cut in, her words sharp and deliberate. "It's not about being a crusader, Max. It's about recognizing that entertainment can be more than just empty spectacle. It can actually have meaning, but if you keep feeding the machine, you'll find yourself irrelevant." The crowd, still a bit on edge from the unexpected backstage disruption, was now fully invested in the drama unfolding on stage. No longer passive viewers, they leaned forward in anticipation, as if the tension in the air had become contagious. Max, realizing the magnitude of the situation, clenched his jaw and let out a short laugh. "You two are delusional. You've lost touch with reality, and that's why you'll never truly get it." But Sandra wasn't done. "Maybe the real problem, Max, is that you've spent your entire career feeding off others' misery. But you can't do it forever. People will always catch on." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, the set was completely still. Max, his composure slipping further, stood up abruptly. "You think you can lecture me on reality?" he sneered. "I built this empire. This show. I decide what people watch. And right now the world is watching us. You want to talk about relevance? This show is my kingdom, and you're just passing through." But the words fell flat. Max had underestimated the public's hunger for authenticity, for sincerity. In the age of social media, audiences no longer only watched, they participated, they judged, they engaged. Max's cruel antics, once seen as clever jabs, were starting to backfire. And as his show's audience base began to shrink, rumors of discontent behind the scenes started to gain traction. Meanwhile, backstage, the disturbance continued to escalate. The protesters, initially believed to be a small, disorganized group, were now gaining momentum. Reports came in that the security personnel had been overrun, and the protesters were starting to make their way toward the stage. It was clear now that the breach wasn't a random occurrence. Someone, or something, had orchestrated this moment with precision. Max's facade of control began to crumble. As the audience grew increasingly uneasy, the producers rushed to Max's side, urging him to wrap up the show. But Max, desperate to salvage what little power he had left, shook them off. "No," he snapped. "We're not stopping the show. Not now." But in that moment, it was clear to everyone involved. This was no longer just a battle of words. It was the beginning of a war for control, and Max had underestimated the people he thought he could manipulate. Tom and Sandra had remained composed, offering only truth and conviction. They had no need to fight back with petty insults. They were already winning, simply by being real. As the chaos continued to unfold behind the scenes, the camera continued to roll, capturing every fleeting moment. What had started as a simple talk show interview was now a pivotal moment in the battle for authenticity in the world of entertainment. The moment the doors to the backstage area burst open, it felt as if the world itself had shifted. The atmosphere, already thick with tension, suddenly became suffocating. The protesters, once a vague threat murmured about in the control room, now poured into the studio in a forceful, almost orchestrated manner. Some of them wore t-shirts with slogans that read "Truth over spectacle," and "We're done with the circus." Others held signs that simply stated, "The people are watching." It was no longer just an isolated incident. It was a full-scale protest, a movement that had been quietly building in the shadows for weeks. Max Caldwell, ever the calculated talk show host, had always prided himself on his ability to maintain control. He prided himself on his razor-sharp wit and his mastery of steering public opinion. But as the protesters grew louder and more insistent, as their chants reverberated through the studio, Max realized that control was slipping through his fingers, and he couldn't stop it. The cameras, still rolling, captured every second. For a fleeting moment, Max wondered if he could call a break, cut to commercials, salvage some semblance of order. But the look on the faces of his producers told him everything. There was no stopping this now. The show had become a spectacle of its own, but not the one Max had imagined. It had become something far more dangerous, something far more raw. Meanwhile, Tom Cruise and Sandra Bullock, who had been sitting patiently in their seats, exchanged a brief glance. There was no fear in their eyes. They were no strangers to the unpredictability of public life, and neither one of them had ever been afraid to speak their truth, even in the face of intense pressure. But this situation was different. It wasn't just the hostile atmosphere from Max. It was the unmistakable sense that something important was about to happen, something that would change everything. Sandra spoke first, her voice steady, but with a trace of urgency. "Max, you've spent your entire career playing with fire. Now you've lit a blaze you can't control." Her words carried the weight of someone who had seen the dark side of fame and had learned how to rise above it. You can't keep hurting people for the sake of entertainment. This is what happens when you think you're untouchable. Max, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment, shot her a cold glare. His fingers tightened around the edge of the desk. "You think this is about me?" His voice trembled slightly, betraying his rising panic. "This is about power. Control. The show must go on. You too, you're just distractions. You think the world cares about you? This is about me. This is about what I've built." But Sandra wasn't intimidated. She knew exactly how to wield her words. "No, Max. You're wrong. The world doesn't care about your empire. They care about something real. And you can't bully people into silence anymore." Tom, who had been listening quietly, finally leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with intensity. "You're right, Sandra. The show doesn't have to go on the way Max thinks it should. But that's what you don't understand, Max. The world has changed. The audience has changed. People aren't tuning in for what you think they want. They're tuning in for the truth. For something genuine." He paused, letting his words settle in. "And you've been lying to them. All this time, you've been manipulating them, thinking you're invincible. But there's no such thing as invincibility when the truth is on the line." Max's eyes flickered between the two of them, disbelief written all over his face. The protesters' chants grew louder as they neared the stage, their movement echoing through the studio. This was no longer just an interview. This was a confrontation. And Max was starting to realize in that moment that his empire had crumbled right in front of him. The protests were growing more intense by the second, with some of the more vocal protesters now standing at the edge of the stage, holding up their signs and shouting their messages of defiance. The crew, caught between a sense of duty to their jobs and the growing unrest, seemed uncertain of how to respond. Some looked to Max for direction, others to the security team, who were now scattered and overwhelmed by the sheer number of people flooding into the space. "Get them out of here," Max shouted, his voice rising with desperation, but his commands only added fuel to the fire. The chaos in the studio was too far gone for even the best security team to regain control. And then something unexpected happened. A figure stepped into the studio, seemingly unnoticed by the frantic crew or the protesters. It was one of the producers, who had been handling the technical side of the broadcast, and she was holding a piece of paper that caught the light in a way that made everyone pause. She walked directly toward the stage, moving through the sea of protesters and making her way toward Max. Her face was pale, and her eyes wide with a mix of shock and concern. As she reached Max, she handed him the paper, but instead of speaking, she simply gestured to the screen. Max hesitated for a moment, his mind racing as he looked at the paper, his hand still gripping the edge of the desk. The tension in the studio was at a boiling point, with the protesters chanting louder and louder as they gathered on stage. But Max had no time to think about that now. He needed to understand what was on the paper. He glanced at it, and the blood drained from his face. The document he held was a list of names. A list of celebrities who had been approached, some willingly and some not, to be part of Max's controversial tactics. This was the key to the web of manipulation Max had been weaving for years, using his power and influence to manipulate public opinion and silence those who dared to speak out. "Everything you've built, Max," Sandra said softly, her words cutting through the chaos. "It's all coming undone. This is the truth. And there's nothing you can do to hide it anymore." Max's heart pounded in his chest. The weight of what was happening felt unbearable. He had spent his entire career building an empire on the foundation of secrets and lies, using his power to control everything around him. But now, as the truth was revealed before his very eyes, he realized the show was over. This was the moment he had been dreading. The moment when everything he had carefully constructed crumbled in a single instant. The protesters' chants echoed louder in his ears, their voices growing in unison. Max's world had turned upside down. He wasn't the puppet master anymore. He was the one being pulled by the strings. And in that moment, the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He had lost control. The studio was silent for a brief, suffocating moment. Max stood frozen, staring at the paper in his hands. His mind was racing, trying to process the implications of the list he held. He had spent years maneuvering, manipulating, and bending the truth to his will. But now, the truth was undeniable. It was on paper, right in front of him, laid bare for the entire world to see. The protesters, sensing the shift in the energy of the room, began chanting louder, their voices growing with the power of unity. "Expose the lies! Expose the lies!" The chants reverberated through the studio, a relentless wave of defiance crashing against the walls of Max's carefully built empire. There was no turning back now. Sandra stood up slowly, her gaze unwavering. She walked toward Max, her footsteps measured and deliberate. Tom, too, rose from his seat, a calm but determined presence beside her. Together, they stood in stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around them. They were a beacon of truth in a sea of noise, and they knew what they had to do. Max's face contorted with a mix of panic and rage. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the paper tighter, his breath shallow. This is not what you think," he stammered, though the words felt hollow, unconvincing even to him. The confidence that had once been his trademark was now gone, replaced by a desperate, almost pleading tone. But Sandra wasn't buying it. She had been in this industry long enough to know when someone was trying to salvage their pride at the expense of others. "Max, you've lied to everyone. To us. To your audience. To yourself. And now, You're not even able to own up to it. Her voice was steady, her words hitting with the force of a well-placed punch. Tom stepped forward as well, his voice calm but laced with authority. You think you control the narrative, Max. You think you can bury the truth under layers of lies and manipulation. But people are done listening to your lies. They want to see the truth. His eyes locked with Max's, a challenge in his gaze. And it's time for you to face it. For a moment, Max stood motionless, his eyes darting from Sandra to Tom, as if trying to find a way out of the inevitable. The weight of his actions had finally caught up with him, and the knowledge that he was powerless to stop the tide of truth from sweeping him away was overwhelming. The audience, who had been watching in stunned silence, began to murmur. The realization that something monumental was happening, something that would forever change the landscape of media, was sinking in. The camera continued to roll, capturing every moment, every expression. Max turned toward the control room, his voice barely above a whisper. Cut the feed. Now. His command was frantic, but the producer in the control room, already overwhelmed by the events unfolding, simply shook her head. There was nothing left to cut. The world was watching. And just like that, the curtain fell on Max's reign. The lies, the manipulation, the facade. All of it was exposed for what it truly was. There was no escaping the truth now. Sandra, still calm and resolute, spoke one final time. Max, it's over. The people you've hurt, the lives you've destroyed, they all deserve to know the truth. It's time for you to take responsibility. Tom turned to the protesters, who had now gathered at the edge of the stage, their faces filled with a mix of triumph and exhaustion. The battle had been long, but they had won. The truth was out. The show, once a symbol of power and control, had now become a symbol of its own downfall. The room was filled with a heavy silence, the air thick with the weight of what had just transpired. The stage, once the backdrop of Max's grand performances, was now the site of his undoing. It was clear that there would be no smooth resolution, no way to recover from this. Max was finished. But in the midst of the chaos, Sandra and Tom remained composed, the quiet strength in their presence speaking volumes. They had done what needed to be done, and as the lights dimmed and the show came to its inevitable end, it was clear that they had won, not because they had taken down Max, but because they had stood up for the truth. The protesters, their voices still echoing in the background, had become more than just a group of angry individuals. They had become the force that had toppled the empire built on lies. And as the final words were spoken, it was clear that the world was forever changed. The power of truth, of honesty, and of standing up for what was right had triumphed over the corruptive force of arrogance and manipulation. As the studio emptied and the cameras stopped rolling, the message was clear. The truth always finds a way to break through. The studio was slowly emptying, the once bustling set now a shell of its former self. The protesters, their chants still lingering in the air, began to file out, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. They had fought for what they believed in, and now, in the aftermath, it was clear they had won. There was no victory lap, no grand celebration. The world was changing, and all they could do was wait for the inevitable shift in the public's perception. Sandra Bullock and Tom Cruise remained on the stage, their presence a calm force amidst the lingering chaos. The crew, still in shock from the events that had unfolded, were packing up equipment, their eyes avoiding Sandra and Tom. It was as though the entire world had just witnessed a revolution, and they weren't sure what their place in it was anymore. Max Caldwell, the once untouchable host, had been escorted out of the studio after his failed attempt to salvage the situation. His face, red with fury and humiliation, had been a stark contrast to the calm resolve of Sandra and Tom. He had thought he could control the narrative, bend reality to his will, but in the end, he had been undone by his own arrogance. And now, as he faced the consequences of his actions, he was a man without a show, without an empire. Sandra stood silently, her gaze fixed on the empty space where Max had once sat, confident and unchallenged. She had always known the price of speaking out, of standing up against the powerful forces that sought to control the narrative. But she had never backed down. And today, she felt the weight of that decision more than ever. She had watched as Max's empire crumbled before him, And while a small part of her felt a sense of justice in the moment, another part of her couldn't help but feel the hollow sting of a victory that came at a high cost. Tom broke the silence, his voice soft but filled with a quiet strength. "We did the right thing, Sandra." She nodded, her eyes never leaving the spot where Max had stood. "I know. But it's hard not to feel a little empty, you know? We took down one man, but the system is still in place. The media still has so much control over how people think." Tom took a step closer to her, offering a reassuring smile. "It's a start. The truth is out there now, and the world is watching. It's just going to take time for the real change to sink in. But we've made a difference." Sandra glanced over at him, her gaze softening. "I hope you're right. But I've seen this game played too many times. I've seen people win battles only for the same issues to rise up again in a different form." "Yeah," Tom agreed, his expression growing more thoughtful. "But that doesn't mean we stop fighting. It just means we have to keep pushing, keep showing up. The more people see the truth, the harder it is for the lies to take root again." Sandra gave a small, almost wistful smile. "I guess that's the job of the real heroes. The ones who keep going, even when it seems like nothing changes." Tom looked out at the empty studio, his eyes lingering on the vacant chairs where the celebrities and the audience had once sat, oblivious to the tectonic shift happening around them. "Yeah, the real heroes are the ones who keep pushing, even when the world doesn't seem to notice." For a long moment, the two of them stood there in the silence, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. Neither of them had expected it to end this way. They had come to the talk show to talk about their latest projects, to play the game like everyone else. But instead, they had become part of a much bigger story. A story about the power of truth, the consequences of arrogance, and the need for a deeper level of responsibility in the media. Max Caldwell, once a man with the world at his feet, had seen everything he had built come crashing down in an instant. His arrogance had led him to underestimate the power of the truth, and now he would have to face the fallout of his actions. But the true cost of his rise and fall was not just his own humiliation. It was the lives he had affected, the people he had manipulated, and the system he had helped perpetuate. And as Max was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered career, the question remained: would he learn from his mistakes, or would he simply fade into obscurity, another casualty of his own pride? As for Sandra and Tom, they both knew that the fight wasn't over. It was far from it. They had exposed one man's hypocrisy, but the system that allowed men like Max to thrive was still in place, still powerful, still dangerous. But that didn't mean they would stop. They would keep pushing, keep speaking out, and keep fighting for a world where truth wasn't something that had to be uncovered. It was something that was given freely, without manipulation, without fear. "I guess it's time to leave this circus behind," Sandra said with a light chuckle, trying to shake off the heaviness that had settled in her chest. Tom smiled, his eyes brightening. "You know, I think that's the best decision you've ever made." They turned together, walking off the stage side by side, the bright studio lights now dimming behind them. As they exited the building, the sound of the protesters' chants could still be heard in the distance, fading as they left the world of the showbiz circus behind. They had done what needed to be done, and now, they could only wait to see how the world would change in the wake of their actions. It was a victory, but it was just the beginning. Days passed, and the news of the dramatic showdown at the talk show spread like wildfire. Clips of Max Caldwell's unraveling were all over social media, and public reaction was swift and divided. Some hailed Sandra and Tom as heroes who had stood up for the truth, while others questioned the ethics of their actions. But one thing was undeniable: their confrontation had sparked a conversation, a ripple in the media landscape that could not be ignored. Max Caldwell, once the darling of the talk show world, quickly became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked arrogance and manipulation. His empire, built on deception, crumbled as advertisers pulled their support and viewers tuned out in droves. It wasn't just his career that had collapsed. It was his reputation, his entire persona, which had been carefully curated over the years, shattered beyond repair. But for Sandra and Tom, the aftermath was more complicated than the headlines suggested. While they had emerged victorious, they knew the victory was not theirs alone. It belonged to the protesters, to the millions of people who had quietly witnessed years of media manipulation and deceit, who had finally found their voices. In the days that followed, Sandra took a step back from the limelight, not because she was afraid, but because she knew that the fight was far from over. She made public statements urging the industry to take a long, hard look at the way it operated. She spoke about accountability, about the need for transparency, and about the responsibility of the media to tell the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. Tom, too, took the opportunity to reflect on the lessons he had learned throughout the ordeal. He realized that his fame and his platform could be used for more than just promoting movies and projects. It could be used to spark change, to raise awareness, to challenge the status quo. And so, he began to speak more openly about the importance of ethics in media, becoming an advocate for truth and integrity in the entertainment industry. The world was shifting, slowly but unmistakably. As for Max, he faded from public view. There was no grand apology, no redemption arc for him. His name became synonymous with dishonesty, and no amount of damage control could fix what had been broken. His fall from grace was a sobering reminder that no matter how high you rise, your actions will eventually catch up with you. But the most significant change came in the hearts and minds of the people. The audience had seen the power of truth, the strength in standing up for what is right. They saw that the heroes were not always the ones with the loudest voices or the most power, but those who remained steadfast in their commitment to integrity, no matter the consequences. Sandra and Tom never sought fame for their actions. They didn't want a victory lap, didn't seek the accolades that came with their stand. Instead, they continued to live their lives with humility and wisdom, knowing that the real change had already begun. And as the years passed, the memory of that fateful day lived on, reminding people that no matter how far the lie may stretch, the truth will always find a way to rise. The world had witnessed a powerful reminder. Truth, no matter how uncomfortable, will always prevail over arrogance, manipulation, and deceit. The lesson was clear, and it was a lesson that would stay with the world for generations to come.